A Lantern, Chapter 24. It seemed to Abby the years began to move more quickly now. The leaves of the almanac cover over the wooden kitchen sink were turned with almost unbelievable rapidity. Abby never tore them out and never destroyed one of these outlived chronicles of time. "Don't you ever burn up any of the old things that have accumulated?" Isabelle asked when she was home from the university. "Oh, no," Abby said hastily. "Why not?" "Oh, I don't know. Someone might need them sometime. I've always found a use for everything." And so every button, every string, every paper sack was carefully hoarded. Isabelle was in the second semester of her sophomore year. She had only 2 dresses, her brown school dress and her tan Sunday one. But she had a knack of wearing them well. It was the era of the throttled throats. Isabelle would pin a long ribbon at the front of her neck, wrap it tightly several times around that maltreated part of her anatomy, and tie it in a huge bow under her ear. "It's a wonder it doesn't shut off your epiglottis or whatever it is you sing with," Abby said in disgust. Isabelle was attractive with her reddish-brown hair and her eyes and her mellow voice. Attractive apparently to Harrison Rhodes, a young man who sang in the same choir with her. When he'd been out to the farm and sung Whispering Hope with Isabelle, looking down at her while she played the accompaniment, Abby thought that all who ran could read, and the language of the message was in the Esperanto, the universal language of romance. But then I'm sort of a romantic, Will, and maybe I just imagine it. I thought so too, Abby. In June of that year, a national political convention named a Nebraska man for its presidential candidate. He was defeated in November, but Abby said, "At least they know now there are some states west of the Mississippi." Letters came home from John regularly, and Abby thought to herself with no small amount of glee that John was far more communicative through the medium of pen and paper than when he was with her. His firm was getting along pretty well, although he himself was not doing much more than the collections and looking up references. He would be glad when he had a real case. Later, he had joined the local unit of National Guards. They met and drilled right along. Rather foolish, maybe, when there was no likelihood of a war, but it was good for them, as they were mostly fellows in offices. His foot bothered him yet sometimes, a little stiff after he drilled. Peace had been over the land for 30 years, and then suddenly there was no peace. Spanish-American controversies, which had been piling up like so many logs on a pyre, were touched off by a match of news which flashed across the land. The Maine had been sunk in Havana's harbor, and in the Wing and L farmhouse behind the cedars, Abby Deal was reading a letter from John. "And so we arrived here at Camp Des Moines Tuesday. It was the most impressive and magnificent sight I ever saw yesterday morning. The GAR and band and drum corps escorted us to the depot, and thousands of people on every side waved flags and cheered and cried as we marched along. At the station, friends were bidding goodbye, and mothers, sisters, and sweethearts were weeping and saying their farewells. We arrived in Des Moines, and our regiment was quartered in the speed stables. We have 10 box stalls to each company. I didn't come home first, for I didn't want to say goodbye to you. I know how you will feel, Mother. But if you saw a bully licking a little youngster, you would think I was cowardly if I didn't jump in and—" Yes, how the words came back. A boy she knew long ago had said the same thing. War again, how terrible. Oh God, stop war. "Our John's going to war, Will." Abby's stiff lips could hardly frame the words. "I would have wanted him to do his duty." And then Abby could think of almost nothing but her boy. Could do almost nothing but fix things to send him. Cookies, a cake, a needlebook, a testament. Always the Abby Deals must be doing something for their children. The letters came frequently. John was willing enough now to pour out his thoughts to his mother. "Our regiments commenced where the numbers of the regiments of the old Civil War ceased. That is, the 1st National Guard, the regiment of our company belongs to, is now the 49th. "Why, how terrible!" Abby looked up from her letter. How terrible that the numbers should go right on. Would they always go on? Mac's little boy Stanley, little Fred Baker, Jr., 4 and 6 now. In 20 or 30 years, the idea was unthinkable. Oh God, don't let the numbers of the regiments go right on. We found that we all had to submit to another physical examination by our regular army physician. This was the bad news for me, and I feared it on account of the scar on my ankle. A number were rejected, and I was one. Abby's heart gave a bound of relief. John's near tragedy, then, had been a blessing in disguise. But another examination before a board of regimental surgeons passed me. And so there was no relief and no blessing. Nothing but war. There were other boys of the neighborhood going too. Fritz Reinmuller, for one. Ach, with planting time come, Christine said in her half-English. Such a Schlitzeit. Bad time. How queer Christine was to think always of the land and the crops and the money. It had been in April, and John's first letter had come from the box stall in Des Moines' speed stable. On a warm night in May, Isabelle came walking up the lane road under the poplars. Abby had not expected her home, and she ran to the sitting room with cheery words of greeting. On the porch steps, Isabelle stood and looked at her mother with wide, tragic eyes. Did nothing, said nothing, but stood and looked with wide, tragic eyes. Isabelle! Abby's heart was pounding tumultuously. What is it? I'm married. The girl's voice was dull without expression. Married? Abby repeated in a voice as equally as dull, and with equal lack of expression. Isabelle put out her hand. There was a wide gold band on her slender finger. Last night. And he's gone. You mean you're married to... He's gone, she repeated dully. There was only one man in the world, so why name him? You married Harrison Rhodes before he left? For San Francisco. Abby pulled Isabelle into the house and with shaking hands took off the girl's hat. They'll be sent to the Philippines, Isabelle said in that same expressionless way. Abby was trembling in every limb. She had read about such things happening to other mothers, and now it was happening to her. She could not think it, that her own little Isabelle Deal had married in that hasty manner. Why, she wasn't even Isabelle Deal. She was Isabelle Rhodes. Everything seemed tumbling about Abby's head, all her plans for her musical girl. Why, Isabelle was only finishing her sophomore year. And then suddenly, Abby thought of the pearls lying in the velvet box in the old calfskin-covered chest, waiting for Isabelle to be a bride. For a moment, a great disappointment overstopped all her other emotions. Oh, why had Isabelle done this hasty thing? Oh, Isabelle, without a wedding! I've always wanted every one of my girls to have a wedding at home. What difference is a wedding? Isabelle began to cry, great wrenching sobs that shook her. Abby put comforting arms around her. There, dearie. That's right. After all, what difference is a wedding? He cared for nothing in the world but me and music, Isabelle said in her bitterness. But he went to war. Abby held her close, rocked her as if she were a child. Yes, Isabelle. They care for nothing in the world but women and their work, and they go to war. Isabelle would not go back to school for the remaining few weeks of the year. She would only sit at home and wait dully. And now Abby had the new experience of attempting to keep another person courageous. It was more trying than trying to keep up her own spirits. Why must she always be strong for other people? How Isabelle sapped at her strength. She seemed to have no stamina. Sometimes Abby thought the girl was selfish in it, and then she would say, "But I'm her mother. I'm the one for her to take her troubles to." Abby had John to think about also. She felt a little jealous that Isabelle was thinking of Harrison all the time, when John was in the same danger. By the middle of June, John the lawyer was sweltering at Drill Camp Libre in Florida, and Harris, who cared for nothing in the world but Isabelle and music, was sweltering before Fort Milady doing outpost duty. They came home in the summer of '99. Harrison, who had been in much action, came home fairly well. John, who had done only camp and guard duty, came pale, emaciated and weak from typhoid contracted in Cuba. Harrison and Isabelle made plans to move immediately to Chicago. Abby thought she could not stand it to have Isabelle so far away. Why did children do that? It made her envy Christine, whose children were all settling down on the various 80s that Gus had bought. Heine here, Emile there, even Fritz, just home from the Philippines, had married and started into the field. Isabelle took the piano. I hate to, Mother. With Grace 11 now, it seems selfish. No, you take it, Abby told her. Grace can't bear to practice. She just reads and reads. My, how different you children all are. And then it came about that Chicago seemed not far, almost neighborly in comparison with John's new location. After recuperating at home that summer, John left for Seattle and Nome. Abby was stunned. Nome, in Alaska, from which there could be no return in the fall after the ice had frozen, from which there would come no word until late spring when the ice had gone out. In his characteristic way, John had told his plan casually only a few days before he left. There was a future in Alaska. It was the place for young fellows. Fortunes awaited their picking up. He would open a law office in Nome and keep his eyes open for anything presenting itself on the side. He was using his army money for the purpose. How queer, thought Abby. Just as Will had taken his army money for a long-ago trip into Nebraska. Soldiers of fortune both. Calm and dry-eyed, Abby told her son goodbye. But all winter, day and night, her thoughts were with him. Every night, when she was ready for bed, she would look out over the snow-covered prairie to the northwest, toward the land which no word could go, toward the land from which no word could come. It was June before the first of the winter letters came. There were many. John had written her often. Many nights then, as she stood looking across the snow-wrapped prairie, John had been writing to her. After all, no distance could sever the tie that bound them. Nothing come between her and her silent boy. The letters were of an intense interest to homekeeping Abby, descriptive of the gold rush. Most important of all, John had been appointed U.S. Commissioner and was going up above the Arctic Circle. In the late fall of that year, when Mac and Emma's new boy Stanley was 6, a second son was born to them. They named him Donald, and he immediately upset Abby's plans for Christmas by acquiring colic to such a noisy degree that the Mackenzie family decided to stay in Omaha behind closed doors with their vociferous offspring. The annual Deal reunion did not prove so complete a success as usual, with John and Mac's family all absent. Abby went through all the preparations for the event as she always did. The popcorn balls and the taffy candy, the tree and the little hidden packages. But it was never the same for her when one child was missing. This was the 4th Christmas John had been away from them. More than ever, Abby's thoughts were with John in that far-off land of the midnight sun, now that he was so much farther away than Nome. What was there about John that seemed always to bring her thoughts of anxiety, Abby wondered. From the time he was small, it seemed that she had always thought and prayed more about John than any of the others. His silence, his independence, his ways of doing things without telling her, worried her. And now in Alaska, above the Arctic Circle, with no means of communication until the ice floe should go out. What was he doing? What were his experiences, his pastimes, his temptations? What sort of women was he meeting? Abby would stop at her work and utter a prayer for him, and, sent as it were from the bow of a mother's watchful care, bound by the cord of a mother's love, the little winged arrow on its flight must have reached someone, somewhere. The Dr. Fred Bakers were out at Christmas. Grace, 12, and Fred Jr., 8, were the only children at the Christmas reunion that year. Isabelle and Harrison, though, came from Chicago, enthusiastic over their music. They were both studying and practicing hours every day, and singing in a suburban church choir. They each had a few music pupils. Isabelle looked stylish in her brown silk shirtwaist and wide brown serge skirt with 15 gores stiffened with buckram. The two stayed a day after the Fred Bakers had gone. "Don't you get tired of all the extra noise and work, Mother?" Isabelle wanted to know when they were alone. "Oh, my, no, dear," Abby returned. When you have children, Isabelle, you'll understand what I mean. I might as well tell you, Mother, we're not having children. Not what? Isabelle? I'd rather be honest with you than hear you talk that way. We're not having a family. Why, Isabelle, you talk as though, but I mean it. We're really not well off enough. You know yourself, Mother, that Harris and I will never be rich, and what's more, neither one of us really cares. Mac has a good business head on him, and is well on the way now to being well-to-do. Doctor and Margaret seem to have the ability to lay up treasures where moth can corrupt. No telling what John will do. He may be a big attorney someday. We don't know Grace's future when she's only 12, but all Harrison and I care for is our art. Music is our very life. Knowing that we're going to be so devoted to it, and perhaps never be well enough off, we're just not having children. But Isabelle, if people waited to be rich to have children, if we... Oh, Isabelle, you'd make me laugh if I didn't feel so like crying. Can't afford it? How can you afford to miss it? Little children, their soft, warm bodies and their little clinging hands and their cunning ways. Miss motherhood. Of course, I might have known you wouldn't like it, but I want to devote all my time to my voice. To have children, you ought to have plenty of time and money for their development. Abby looked out the window, down through the long row of cedars. To have plenty of time and money for their development. Instead of the cedars, heavy with snow, she was looking into a sod house where a little painted blackboard stood against the mud-plastered walls, seeing one shelf of books and a slate and some iron pieces of brown wrapping paper. The mother there was hearing reading lessons while she kneaded bread, was teaching songs while she scrubbed, was giving out spelling words while she mended, was instilling into childish minds ideals of honesty and clean living with every humble task. For a long time Abby Deal sat and looked out at the cedars bending under the snow, like so many mothers bending under their burdens. But she did not answer Isabelle. Maybe there was no answer. Perhaps there was no argument. She did not know.